Welcome to Explainer Insight. Today I'm going to explain an American thriller movie called Compliance, released in the year 2012. The movie begins with Sandra, manager of South Chick, which fast food restaurant, waiting for her staff to arrive. After a moment, Becky, along with Kevin, arrives at the fast food restaurant. Sandra begins reminding her staff to be at their best for the night, since a franchise quality control person will come as a secret customer. She also expresses her concern because someone left the freezer door open last night, a reason for their food stocks to get spoiled. Sandra then reminds her staff to be working by the book, not just by making the order right, but also in the right order. Later, the day starts as Sandra's staff begins working. Meanwhile, at the counter, Becky is talking to Marty, the shift supervisor. Becky is expressing that she thinks Sandra is suspecting her of leaving the freezer door open. Marty tells her not to worry, since Sandra thinks that the one who did it is Kevin. Their conversation shifts to the guy Becky is talking to. Suddenly, Sandra joins their conversation, sharing the news that her boyfriend might propose, since her boyfriend called her father already. Marty and Becky give their congratulations to Sandra. Their conversation again shifts to the guy Becky is talking to, who keeps sending him sensual photos. Marty remarks that he and Sandra are too old for that. Sandra then refutes Marty by telling her that her boyfriend knows what to do to keep things exciting and always get her worked up as Sandra leaves. From there, she peeks at them and sees that Becky and Marty are laughing about her statement. They both then continue talking about the guys again. Afterwards, Sandra continues doing her manager duties. She checks on the custodian, Harold, if he is doing his job well. To her surprise, Harold is already done with his tasks. Harold tells Sandra that he may come back later to try some milkshakes. While working, she gets a phone call from her boyfriend, Van, asking her permission to hang out with his friend. Sandra tells Van that he does not need her permission to spend time with his friends. However, Sandra tells Van not to get drunk too much. Sandra says that she is going back to work since they are swamped for the day. She says goodbye and drops the call. Meanwhile, Becky, Kevin and Connie are talking at the counter about changing their working schedule. All of a sudden, Sandra interrupts them and tells them to do their jobs. After a moment, Marty calls Sandra saying that there's a phone call from a policeman at the restaurant office. Sandra goes to the phone and answers it. A man from the other line introduces himself as Officer Daniels from the police department. Officer Daniels tells her that he is in contact with their regional manager, Robert Gilmore. Sandra asks if the call is about the freezer, but the officer dismisses it. He then tells her that the call is about theft. He continues by saying that one of Sandra's employees stole some money from a customer's purse. Officer then describes the identity of the employee he is pertaining to Sandra. To her disbelief, identified refer to employee as Becky. Officer eventually confirms that it is Becky. He also tells Sandra that Becky is also part of a bigger investigation. Sandra gets Becky from the counter and lets Marty take over her station. Sandra then leads Becky to the restaurant office. She lets her talk to the officer. Becky eventually denies all the accusations with officer's commands. Sandra checks Becky's pockets and sees nothing. Sandra also holds onto Becky's phone for the time being. As officer commands the following. He asks Sandra to check Becky's purse. Becky persists that she did not steal anything from anyone. Sandra tells Becky that if she finds something in her purse, she is going to fire her. Becky then lets Sandra check her purse. However, she finds nothing, as Sandra tells officer that there is nothing on Becky's purse. Officer asks her to keep Becky at the restaurant in the meantime and wait for the police to arrive at the restaurant. Sandra agrees, and Becky sits down on a chair. Later, officer tells her that they need to put Becky in a holding cell for the night. He then states that in order to keep the situation contained, he asks Sandra to strip search Becky. However, Sandra expresses her discomfort in doing it. Officer tells her that if she does not do this, there can be a trial that can take a long time and a direct cost to Becky being taken in. Officer then lets Sandra tell Becky to stay in a holding cell for the night or undergo strip searching at the restaurant office. Becky expresses that she does not want to consent for both of it, since she did not steal anything. Sandra further explains to Becky on what will happen if she won't choose. Eventually, Becky decides to be strip searched, but she wants Marty to be there in the restaurant office. Officer agrees with the condition. Sandra goes out to get Marty. Meanwhile, Becky continues talking to Officer Daniels. Their conversation leads to Becky's older brother, who has been in trouble with the law. He then remarks that she does not know about her brother, who is still in trouble with the law. Before the conversation goes further, Sandra and Marty arrive to the restaurant's office. Sandra explains to Marty on what is going on. Eventually, Sandra and Marty begin with the strip searching. Becky removes her shirt, undershirt, shoes and pants, as well as her sun visor cap. Sandra checks all of her clothes and informs Officer that she found nothing. He then asks her to check Becky's underwear. Sandra hesitantly asks Becky to take her underwear off. She eventually takes it off and hands it to Sandra. Later, Sandra confirms that there is nothing on her underwear. Officer then tells her to let Becky turn around to check her body after Sandra finds nothing. Officer then asks Sandra to put Becky's clothes in a bag and put them in her car. Since there can be secret pockets that Sandra is not trained to find it. Officer tells her that when they get there, they will check Becky's clothes. With this, Marty finds it suspicious to put the clothes in Sandra's car when the police can check the clothes inside the restaurant office when they arrive. Sandra then questions the officer if she can just leave the clothes of the restaurant office. Officer Daniels answers that he will not allow it, since if the clothes stay with Becky, she may slip the stolen money somewhere and get away with what she has done. Sandra does not seem to buy what Officer said. Eventually, Officer reveals it to Sandra that they are searching Becky's house, since Becky's older brother may be involved with selling illegal drugs and that Becky may also be selling it. Officer also tells Sandra that since this is a more extensive investigation, they are hoping that they can find the stolen money. Then they can bring Becky in and get a confession for the drugs investigation. After Sandra puts Becky's clothes in her car, she goes back to the office restaurant. Marty goes back to help Connie at the counter. Sandra then tells Officer that she needs to resume managing the restaurant since it is their busiest time. Officer tells her that they are in the middle of searching Becky's house, so it will take longer than a minute to get to the restaurant. He then asks her if she has an employee trustworthy enough to watch Becky. After a moment, Sandra gets Kevin to the restaurant office. Sandra then explains to Kevin that Becky may have stolen money from a customer and that her brother is in trouble, too. Kevin tells her that Becky did not do it and her brother cannot be in trouble since he knows Becky's brother personally. Sooner Sandra lets Kevin watch Becky until the police get to the restaurant. Later, Officer asks Kevin to take off the apron and inspect Becky's whole body. Becky tells him that Sandra already did that to her. Kevin becomes suspicious of Officer Daniels and tells him that he is going to leave for a second. Kevin walks out of the restaurant office and Sandra stops him. He tells her that Becky is his friend and he does not want to do anything with the situation. Sandra has no choice but to go back to the restaurant office. She asks Officer on what happened, and Officer Daniel says that Kevin is unprofessional. Officer then scolds Sandra for telling Kevin about the confidential information involving Becky's brother. Eventually, Officer gives her a choice between watching over Becky by herself or to find someone reliable to watch Becky. He then brings up Sandra's boyfriend and to come by the restaurant and help. Sandra hesitates at first, but eventually she agrees and calls Van to come to the restaurant. After a while, Van arrives to the restaurant. Sandra explains everything to Van, and she lets him keep an eye on Becky while watching over Becky. Officer orders Van to force Becky to remove her apron and check her body. Van tells Officer that he can't make him do it. Officer tells him to give the phone to Becky. Eventually, Officer manipulates Becky into letting Van check her whole body. Officer also asked Becky to perform naked, jumping jacks in front of Van to expose suspected contraband in her body sooner. Becky tries to persuade Sandra about the trauma as she comes into the restaurant office for a quick visit. When she leaves, the restaurant office officer demands Van to spank Becky as a punishment for her being disobedient. Right after Officer forces Becky again, this time to try Van's sausage. Later, Officer requests Sandra to look for another guy to take Van's place after Van leaves feeling guilty of what Officer let him do. Sandra then assigns the custody to Harold, who comes back at the restaurant for a milkshake to watch over Becky. Sandra again explains the situation to Harold. Eventually, Officer Daniel's command of taking Becky's apron off again enrages Harold. Sandra calls Robert Gilmore, the regional manager, after Harold informs her of Officer Daniel's inappropriate orders. Robert Gilmore tells Sandra that he has been sick for the whole day and no police have contacted him. Sandra finally realizes that officer's call is a spam. When the police arrive, they lead Becky out and search for evidence. Later, Detective Niels investigates the incident. He assigns police officer on what to do and where to start investigating. And he calls people who may be able to help the case. He eventually finds out that similar events are documented from that very same guy who was found to be a telemarketer and a family man. After a closed investigation of recordings, they identify the caller and Daniel is arrested. The movie ends with Becky requesting to pursue a legal complaint against Sandra, but her lawyer proposes that she should target the restaurant instead. Sandra, who today is out of a job, ends her relationship with Van following the event, and she is asked by a journalist about it. But she is not able to answer all of the questions since her lawyer is there. It shows that in almost 30 states in the US, over 70 similar real incidents happened over the past years. That was all from the video. I hope you liked it. Subscribe for more content like this and hit the like button to help us out. Also, leave a comment if you want us to explain your favorite movie. Until next time, take care.